Snow fell upon the broken city like ash, soft and patient as if the sky had decided to shroud all memory. John stood in the dragon pit with the wind threading his hair and the stench of old dust and burned bones in his lungs, and felt, for the first time since the dead fell, that the world had slowed enough for a man to choose something other than regret. The pit's yawning mouth had witnessed triumphs and cruelties older than his name. Now it would witness something else. Drogon's breath warmed his back without touching skin, the heat of a hearth that knew how to become a wildfire in a blink. The great beast's yellow eye, half-lidded, followed a ragged procession of lords and envoys gathered on the shattered tiers. Some had cloaks too clean for a city like this. Others wore their wounds like sieges continuing beneath cloth, bandaged ribs, split lips, the quiet tremor of hands that had held lines and lost friends. They had come because he had asked and because the dragon had flown. Some, though, had come to make sure their own names survived the new age. John watched them breathe steam in the cold and recognized the hunger that rules break upon. He had thought many words were impossible to speak, yet pain had taught him what duty and love together could demand of a man. He remembered her hand on his cheek, a single tear striking his thumb. He remembered the hilt's cold certainty. He remembered the wind as Drogon rose with his fury and his grief, bearing her away like a ship bearing a star. John raised his gloved hand and the dragon pit listened. Even the carrion gulls turned their heads as if the ruins themselves had ears. "You know my name," he said. "You know what I've done and what I failed to do." The silence deepened. Drogon's tail, heavier than an oaken beam, coiled with the whisper of scales on stone. "You know I am of the north. You know I am of the blood that broke and bound this realm. Both truths live in me, and neither has given me peace." John swallowed, tasting iron from the dried crack at his lip. "I did not ask for a crown. I will not wear one." Murmurs, disbelieving, pleased and wary in equal measure. A lord in gilded green from what remained of the reach lifted his chin sharply, as if a noose had been loosened from his neck. A stern woman of the Vale folded her hands beneath her cloak and studied him anew. "But I will decree," John said, "once only, one decree, while a dragon yet flies and men still fear enough to listen. Hear me, the noble houses of Westeros are ended." There was no sound at first. Winter hung like a blade without weight. Then the dragon pit erupted. A dozen voices at once, outrage, incredulity, laughter hard as cups thrown at a tavern wall. "Who are you two? What is any realm without? Treason to blood? Ridiculous. This is madness." The old songs in new tongues, the chorus as predictable as the ocean's answer to rocks. Drogon hissed, not loud, but the sound entered the bone before it entered the ear. Torches guttered. The fine lord in green lowered himself without meaning to, knees bending. The words dwindled until the quiet had weighed again. "The houses are ended," John repeated, more softly, because he had learned that softness could cut more cleanly than a shout. "No child will be born to a fealty he never swore. No lord will hold a keep because a grandam lifted a finger once, on a field his grandchildren never saw. Land is to be held by those who work it, ships by those who sail them, offices by those elected to them by the folk who live beneath their decisions. The wall stands to guard the living. It is not a crown's border, but a promise. The realm will have councils, not bloodlines, local councils, chosen freely, a great council, chosen from among them. Wardens no more, but stewards, answerable and removable. The faith will bless if it wills and refuse if it must. A dragon will not judge men any longer. Men will." "You speak of a world that has never existed," said the Vale woman. Her voice was iron, but iron sometimes rings just before it breaks. "And you expect us to nod?" "I expect you to resist," John said. "And then I expect you to see the winter that comes when you do. It has many names. Hunger, debt, plague, bandits. Houses cannot feed a child who has no name in their hall, and gold cannot warm hands gone blue. I have seen what walls do when they are too proud to listen." A thin lord of the Riverlands spat darkly on the stones. "What will you do when 1,000 banners rise and march? You will burn us to ash and claim this justice for your own." John looked at Drogon. The dragon's eye blinked, lid sliding sideways like a closing gate. "No," John said, "but you might believe I would." And that belief is enough for today. A younger envoy, cheeks smooth as new oak, had not learned the slow caution of his elders. And who enforces this dragon decree, once the dragon returns to wherever dragons go? What prevents some gilded butcher from wearing your words as his mask and ruling by the fear you've sharpened? Us, said a voice Jon knew as if he had first learned to speak it on a whipping wind. Davos stepped into the gray light, scar and kindness both older than the stones. If we're to be worth what we say we are. When the uproar came again, it was less sure of its own flavor. The notion that the thing could happen, impossible as thunder beneath snow, had moved from jest to the realm where fear builds foundations overnight. Where will you begin? Asked the woman of the Vale, practical as a hearth. It cannot be everywhere. King's Landing, Jon said. We clear the ruins we can clear, open the granaries that are not ash, restore the wells. The city will be our proof or our failure. Then we write the charters in full. We call elections by the moon's turning and bind the results in oaths, not to a man but to the law itself. We will need scribes. We will need witnesses. We will need to learn new words for old sins. A parcham, Ent, grunted the River Lord, cannot stop a blade. Then we will use blades to guard the parchment and ensure the blades answer to it, not the other way around. Jon's tone grew rough, memory scraping it raw. We know what happens when a single will commands and none dare answer. We've seen that city. They felt the heat of the dragon even when he was still. It reminded them of what language had failed to accomplish in 1,000 years, and what fire had accomplished in a single hour. The Lord's eyes slid to the shadows where their attendants stood, to the silent men in drab cloaks whose hands rested carefully away from sword hilts. Power counted itself, even as it died. What of the North? Asked a voice like leather on stone. Wyman Manderley's nephew bore the cheeks of his line and a belly he had not had time to grow. My lady, your sister. My sister will not be commanded, Jon said simply. Not by me, not by any. She will answer by the North's will, as all must. I go to her first, because I am of the North, and because I would like to see our father's words mean something that endures. The Iron Bank will not like it, someone muttered with the reflex of an old dread. They never like anything that cannot be compounded, Davos said dryly, and a few remembered to smile. We'll let them count with us. There'll be plenty of counting. Send your messengers, Jon said, and your spies. I expect both. I will not hide. If your houses persist in styling themselves alive, they will do so without a realm to devour. Let the new councils feed the people while you polish your lions and roses. We will see which banner fills a belly. He did not dismiss them. That was a lord's gesture. Instead he waited, and one by one they left, like ice breaking late along a river that remembers what water is. Some went in silence with calculation in their eyes. Others muttered oaths they would break tomorrow. A few, fewer than he had feared, bowed not to him but to the idea that had entered the room and sat down without being asked to. When the dragon pit was nearly empty, the Vale woman remained. I was taught to hate dragons, she said, gaze on Drogon, then to fear them. Today I have learned to use one as a measure. Her face made no room for softness. If you come to the Eyrie with this, I will measure you again. I will not be changed by heat. Then be changed by winter, Davos said, weary in the marrow. It's a colder teacher, but some lessons only take that way. She studied Jon once more, like a hawk looking at wind. You will die for this, she told him without rancor. Perhaps not today, but sooner than you would have otherwise. He thought of a woman crying beneath stained glass and nodded. Aye. After she had gone, Jon placed his gloved palm against Drogon's jaw. The dragon hummed, a low furnace in a far room. I never wanted to be a king, Jon said softly, to the beast and to the hole in the sky above. But I can be a hammer. Once. They began in the city. There was rotted grain beneath broken tiles, and grain that only needed a proper seal to be good for another month. There were wells stuffed with the bodies of those who had tried to drink and fallen. There were bakeries where ovens still woke when coaxed. Wine cellars not yet pilfered. Gardens that had gone wild and could be tamed again with the season's patient turning. There were masons who knew how to rebuild walls without carving a crest into the keystone, and seamstresses who could stitch banners that held no animal at all. John slept in a barracks he helped clean. He ate black bread and onion stew with brick dust on his sleeves. He learned that a city has its own metabolism, broken ribs and fever dreams that repeat, that a butcher knows more about hunger than a prince, that midwives carry maps in their hands. He found that when a dragon perched atop the ruins of the Red Keep, men ceased fighting over pieces of lint and remembered there was something larger, whatever name they gave it. They wrote the charters in a scriptorium where the roof had survived by accident or design. Sam's letters flowed like creeks that had found their river. He had arrived on the third day, cheeks wind-burned from the haste of his ride, and had embraced John with an awkward ferocity that knocked dust from them both. "I thought you were going to vanish into some edge of the world," Sam said, "and then, practical as any new father, we'll need institutions. Oaths alone have the life of mayflies." "Institution," Davos said, tasting the word as if it were too long for his mouth. "A fine word. Means place to put the weight, I suppose." "Exactly that," Sam said, "and a way to lift it again." They argued lines while Ash drifted outside, punctuating clauses with swatted soot. Words that had once lived in Godswood Whispers or Master of Law's annals went on to parchment where even a fishmonger could read them if he wanted. They created councils of street, district, city, one feeding the next like vertebrae from tail to skull. They made a great council to bind those councils together, its seats apportioned by the number of souls living beneath them, not by the size of any one man's pasture. They set the terms: 2 years for a street councilor, 5 for a city steward, 7 for a great council member. No consecutive re-election beyond one. They wrote down that crime would be named by harm and tried by a jury of peers drawn at random, and that no man could be imprisoned without charge or held from seeing his family beyond a week, except by unanimous vote of a jury who had to be named and recorded. They carved into the first page Sam's idea that the law is a ladder put up by many, that many may climb it, and who pulls it down beneath himself will find himself beneath it. "You can't put that in a law?" Davos muttered, squinting at the letters. "Sounds like something a septon might say to frighten boys out of a cellar. It belongs on the first page more than in where else," Sam said. "It tells the truth the dry pages forget. If it's there, it's there," John said. "Better a truth that sounds like a song than a song that sounds like a truth." And because parchment is breathless without breathers, they went into the streets. John and Davos, Brienne when she arrived with the handful she had been shepherding through burned villages, Arya like a shadow where lists of the dead could not end. They stood on doorsteps and at market stalls and by pyramids of winter apples. They explained what a council was when a man had never chosen anything beyond a wife or a god. They listened when a woman with hands like bark told them how a tax had broken her daughter's milk and how a soldier had taken her son's hand because he'd reached first for a loaf. They made notes. They crossed out lines. They swore to make the text fit the world rather than the world be broken to fit the text. The faith stood at its windows and watched, shoulders stiff beneath stars and crystals. On the 7th day, the High Septon sent for John. The great September was cracked but not fallen. Its colored panes bled their saints into pale floors rather than walls. The High Septon was neither ancient nor plump. He looked like a scholar who had learned how to rule a palace of incense. He greeted John with the smile of a man who had prepared many answers to questions that had not been asked. "I have heard the humors of your new cure," he said without malice. "You propose to bleed the patient of bloodlines entirely." "Not of blood," John said, "of unearned presumption." "That is one name for ornament," the High Septon said. "Another is tradition." "Tradition," John answered, "is a candle we carry until we realize it's burned past our fingers." The High Septon was silent long enough to give favor to the idea that he could be swayed by cleverness. And then he surprised John by nodding. "I grew up the son of a thatcher," he said. "Before the cloth, I learned what reeds can do together that a single stem cannot. I will bless your counsels if they prove themselves to care for the least among us, but I will not anoint them sacred merely because a dragon roars." "Good," John said, and felt the relief that comes when a thing reveals itself to be what you hoped it was. Then we'll deserve your blessing if we ever get it. The High Septon's gaze softened. And you? Will you ever accept an anointing? I don't belong on any altar, Jon said, catching Davos's eye and his ghost of a grin. I can hardly manage a bench. Word traveled as if the shattered bell had somehow found a new tongue. By the time snow thawed and froze again, the first election filled the city's markets with something not seen in memory. Lines of free men and women, faces solemn and embarrassed, hands ink-smudged, cheeks bright with the act of saying I am part of the question and the answer both. Some joked awkwardly, some muttered prayers, some got angry at the length of the wait, as if this were a new tax imposed upon hours. But at day's end, when the souls who counted finished counting aloud, and the names announced were not those of lords but of midwives, wheelwrights, tanners, singers, apothecaries, schoolmasters, washerwomen, veterans, fishwives with throats that could call through fog, something in the air altered. Even the gulls sounded less like laments. That was when the knives arrived. They came at night as knives prefer. First in Flea Bottom, where the soot has always made it easier to hide a stain. 3 counselors found with throats pink and their ink pots overturned. Then a baker who had called men from his street to chase off a gang of lords' men who were demanding a tithe to keep their old crest from slipping down a wall. Then a girl no older than 13 who had stood on a half-collapsed stair and told her alley that the old way failed them. Her father found her, and the city seemed to hold its breath in a way that was not human. Jon was there when Davos faced the crowd that gathered at dawn. They were men and women who had learned to carry fear without hands. This is what it looks like, Davos said, voice hoarse as rope dragged over stone. When a new way is born, the old way will pin and twist and insist it is your only home. It will do murder and say it is necessity. We mourn our dead. We bury them with names everyone knows. And then we write more names. The men who did this want you to stay in your rooms. Don't let them have your steps. You talk like a lord, someone shouted, the insult well-worn and comfortable. Davos smiled without humor. I talk like a smuggler who has learned what customs are worth obeying and which are worth breaking. Jon knew they would strike at him as well. He did not hide from it. Arya walked ahead of him some nights and behind him others, and when he told her she had no obligation, she looked at him like the wind might look at the sea if it were capable of human contempt. When the assassin came, a thin man with a mouth too small for his teeth who could have been a clerk if not for his eyes. Arya was in the rafters of the scriptorium, and 3 heartbeats after his knife glanced from Jon's leathers. The man hung by the ankle with a noose that looked like it had grown there. And Brienne took his weapon, and Jon listened to the tremble in the man's voice as he explained blood oaths and coin that smelled like lemon and iron. Names, Jon said. I don't know their names, the man whispered. Only hands that didn't shake. When the first great council gathered under a roof whose beams had been pried from the charred bones of manors outside the city, Jon did not preside. He watched as the elected men and women argued like rivers glacier-fed and stubborn. He watched as Davos diffused and Sam clarified, and Brienne, when she did speak, made silence listen. He watched as a blacksmith from the street of smiths told a Septa from the hill of rains that she was foolish, and then looked at his hands, and apologized in front of everyone. He had not seen a lord do that. He smiled when a fishwife told a clerk that if her fish went foul, he would not simply carry the smell on parchment. And the clerk, after bristling, took a day to stand with her among the barrels and learned how rot can hide in the tail. When the council passed its first law, it was not grand. It set the price of grain by a formula that took into account the winter, the size of a family, the income of a street, and the distance from the harbor. It created a ledger of those whose bread was to be free. It empowered the city guard to take from hoarders and pay them a fair price based on that formula. It wasn't a legend. It made fewer hungry. Jon had learned to count victories more carefully. Still, the realm is not a city, and the old world does not drown. It treads water and waits for ships to sink. Sansa's letter arrived as a single sheet of dense, fine writing, smudged where a tear had fallen and been brushed away. Jon read it standing and sitting, by daylight and by candle. You have always wanted to put others first, she wrote. You have done it even when it cost everything. This time you will not be alone in paying. The North is a different song. We are not deaf. We will listen, but we will not be commanded. Come. Hear the voices here. Hear our fears and our pride. If you try to change us from afar, we will resist you as we would any other Southron fire. If you walk in with snow on your boots and honesty in your eyes, we might give you room by the fire long enough to decide if your idea warms our hands or sears them. He looked up at Davos. I have to go. Davos said, and I'll go with you. The city will not fall apart for a fortnight without my bad jokes. They set out with a small company because it is easier to listen when one does not thunder. Brienne, Arya when she pleased. A handful of guards who had learned to answer to laws rather than orders. Drogon flew above them, sometimes so high he was a cut in the cloud. Sometimes so low the horses splayed their ears and men remembered that old fear and found it looked different with a friend inside it. They passed through the riverlands where winter sat like a heavy uncle who does not stand when a woman enters. A lord of no small arrogance barred them at a wooden bridge he called a portcullis in timber. His sigil, 3 fishing spears pointed at a trout, hung limply above the ice-choked water. You will pay for passage, he said, with either coin or penance. Is there a third choice? Davos asked politely. Yes, the lord said, squinting at the dragon-shaped shadow sliding across frost. You could attempt to fly. They paid with a day's work repairing the bridge, plank by plank, because the city had taught them the nobility of hammers. The lord blustered, but he could not declare war upon people mending his world before his eyes. He tried calling it a levy. Davos called it a courtesy. Both managed not to spit. When the bridge held a wagon that had never before crossed in winter, the villagers cheered themselves hoarse, and the lord went inside to drink alone. In an inn 2 nights later, a serving woman recognized Arya from a story that had grown like a vine. She whisked Arya into the kitchen and showed her a knife balanced on 2 bowls, a trick that made the girls laugh until they hiccuped. Jon realized that legends can inspire dread, but it is small tricks that make people love you. Near the neck, marshes breathed out ghosts that were only fog. Howland Reed did not materialize from a reedbed, but walked into their firelight with the humility of someone who knows the world and so does not hurry to declare it. He embraced Jon and, like the High Septon, surprised him by smelling of tools rather than incense. You carry a dangerous thought, Howland said, watching Brienne feed the fire, watching Arya sharpen and console the blade by naming nothing. I carry a thought that has killed people already, Jon said. So perhaps it is real enough to put down for a moment by a warm hearth and ask if we are fools. Howland knelt and drew circles in the ash. A house, he said softly, was once a circle you drew around a fire so the children would know where to come back to. Then someone called it a name. Then someone said they should not have to build the circle again because it already bore their mark. Then someone killed someone who wanted to draw a different circle. The fire did not change. I am trying to draw a larger circle, Jon said, staring at the ember's heart. One that is not named for any one man's father. Then be prepared when a man insists the circle is too large for his child to find again, Howland said, and his gaze was kind and flensing both. You will need songs as much as laws. The North was winter's grammar, written upon him as soon as they crossed out of the trees and into the long exhale of snowfields. Winterfell's towers rose like patient fingers. Sansa stood in the gate as if she had always been there and would be long after anyone tried to move her. When Jon dismounted, she wrapped him in the scent of fur and apples and the clean cold of a woman who has learned to keep her own rooms. You look thinner, she said, which was North for I am glad you live. You look like you could feed 100, he said, which was North for I am glad you lead. They ate in the smaller hall because the large hall felt like someone else's memory when there were not 500 bodies to warm it. Arya vanished and reappeared with 2 shadows and a grin that said she had found the old passages still remembered her feet. Brienne found her place by the wall as she always did, one hand resting upon the table with the tenderness of a prayer. Sansa listened the way needles listen, lightly, precisely, with a readiness to pierce. Jon told her the city's story and the idea's shape and the ugliness that had gathered around both. When he spoke of the girl W. Ho's father found her, Sansa's knuckles whitened upon the edge of the table. She did not look away. When he described the election, Her eyes brightened with a wetness he did not comment upon. He told her, as he told everyone, that he had no crown to offer and did not desire one. "The North remembers," Sansa said when he had finished, a phrase worn to a coin's smoothness but not spent. "And sometimes, Jon, remembering is a way of refusing to change. That has saved us. Also, it has frozen us to places where we should have moved. Our fathers' graves are close enough for us to hear them if we sleep with our ears to the ground. Sometimes all they say is sleep." "What do you say?" Jon asked, a question that had lived in him since her letter. "I say we will try your counsels," Sansa replied, and the hall breathed in too loudly. "Not because you are my brother. Because I have walked through the hunger of a winter where men had grain and others did not. And I learned a song I cannot unlearn. We will not abolish our houses. The North is not a place where a name is only a boast. It is how we sow, but names shall not rule. The Mormonts will stand on Bear Island because the Bear Island folk ask them to stand. The Umbers will guard the last hearth because those who sleep against its walls choose them and can unchoose them. We will answer to a great council of the North and send chosen to yours in King's Landing. We will keep our Godwoods. We will keep our right to tell any Southron to go pee." She stopped herself with a twitch of the mouth that once would have been a girl's giggle. "To go away. But we will not be tyrants in our own land. We will not be what we hate in others." Davos let out a long breath. "Seems a stitch that holds," he said softly. "There will be lords who call me Oathbreaker," Sansa continued. "There will be a few who whisper the word that means traitor and sister both, the other word for woman who leads without a man's leave. Those words are good kindling. I will warm my fingers by them." Later, Jon found Arya in the Godswood. Snow perched on the branches like birds. The heart tree's face had been weeping long before any grief of theirs had occurred to it. Arya stood beside the pool, blade in hand, not moving. He did not speak. The North had taught him long ago what words can do to a scene that belongs to them only by silence. At length she turned, and he saw the small line at the corner of her mouth that meant happiness. "You took the thing that made you a monster in their eyes," she said, "and did not become one." "I might yet," Jon said. "Even a good idea can rot a man from the inside if he lets it be the only thing he eats." She sheathed needle with a sound like a breath after cold. "Then don't eat it alone. That's what we're for." News walked faster than men. By the time Jon left Winterfell, ravens were announcing declarations from Old Town to White Harbor, from Gulltown to Casterly Rock. Some came phrased like pacts. Some came like threats disguised as mirth. Some were the plain stubbornness of people who had learned how to plant turnips and did not see why anyone would call their world less complex than a harbor's. Old Town sent a long letter full of words like equity and suffrage, and a short letter with money enclosed for the building of schools. Gulltown sent a letter asking if the sea was to be counted as a district. Sam wrote back that every fisherman who dwelled upon it would count as much as a man with boots and a doorstep. Casterly Rock sent steel. They struck the city from 3 directions, wearing lions on their chests not as a symbol but as permission. Someone had promised them a return to the world they understood. Someone had paid them. Jon did not wonder long who had emptied his coffers for this purpose. The assault was not a siege so much as a demonstration. See, laws break. He had thought he would have to burn, but the city had grown a spine that steel did not recognize. The guard answered to their elected captains and would not be called away to protect a single door because a crest had once passed through it. The dockworkers rolled carts into barricades with the speed of long practice. The mothers of flea-bottom lifted wash lines turned to thickets. Masons made of rubble what knights make of lances. The blacksmith who had apologized to the Septa stood on a cart and shouted instructions that made men listen because he had once taught them how to hold a hammer without crushing fingers. The faith opened its doors not to an army but to the frightened and the woundable and the men who realized their fury had outrun their courage. Jon rode not at the front but where the line bent. Brienne was a mountain range that moved. Arya vanished and reappeared as if she were practicing a form of breathing that included killing. Davos did not fight as a knight fights, but he knew where men hide when they think no one has ever looked behind a barrel before. Sam, of all people, held the ledger and named names for injuries and for bravery both. because he understood that if the story was not recorded, it could be rewritten by the loudest survivors later. When Drogon descended, it was not upon men but upon swords. His fire ran like a river across steel and left it a wavering memory. The lions looked up and understood that they bore a past that had lost its teeth. Jon turned the dragon like a plow, carving a line of heat that no man wanted to cross first. He did not char flesh. He melted the argument. By nightfall, the lions had become men again. Many surrendered. Some fled and would tell legends of dragon mercy that sounded like contempt. Others would whisper that it was weakness. That was all right. There are worse legends. After the battle, Jon dismounted and walked among the fallen with the ledger in hand. He knelt beside a boy whose cheek still bore the trace of a milk spot and asked his name. The boy whispered it as if embarrassed to have one in such a place. Jon wrote it. He told the boy that the man who had taught him to hold a sword had once said there is no such thing as a good death, but there are good reasons to live. The boy smiled with blood in his teeth and died. Jon closed his eyes and saw a little girl's hands cupped around a fire in a cave beneath the wall. He wondered when he would be allowed a day without carrying someone else's flame. He had chosen this, and still the choosing did not make it light. Valor alone does not hold a system. When the Iron Bank finally sent its delegation, a man with a voice like polished walnut and a woman with eyes that took apart sentences and put them back together in columns. They wore the air of people who had done very well in worlds that considered numbers more permanent than winter. They requested a hearing before the Great Council. They received it, and their speech was very fine. Jon saw many men nod despite themselves at the phrase, predictable returns. What you propose threatens contracts measured in generations, the walnut-voiced man said. Stability is an asset even when unfairly apportioned. Append the board, you append bread. The fishwife stood. She did not raise her voice. Bread is already appended, she said. We are proposing not to eat from the floor. We will require collateral, the woman said, ignoring the ripple of laughter because ignoring is sometimes a way of stone-making. Neither dragon nor principle has ever sufficed for a calculation. Sam's calm was a lake that could drown a grown man. Collateral will be the tax base of the city documented quarterly, a portion of the harbor fees, and the personal guarantee of each councillor, including the right to replace any councillor who refuses to pay by a vote of his street or her street. We will not pledge people. We will pledge what people make. You may call it airy. We call it shared. Shared risk is often a cover for singular irresponsibility, the man murmured. Singular irresponsibility was your previous client's motto, Davos said, weary and sharp. In the end, the Iron Bank did not agree. Neither did they depart in a rage. They watched. Bankers waiting is a kind of siege. The city learned to grow its own credit, storehouses of grain that could be borrowed against. A work-for-pay promise that was as good as coin because the council had written and enforced the law that made it so. The faith surprised everyone by creating a fund for widows that the city later adopted and expanded for men, as well who had lost their wives, and for children who had lost anyone who made bread. Brienne oversaw the small court that tried cases of work refusal and wage theft and made both words mean something other than what anger happens to desire in the moment. Arya disappeared for a month and returned with 3 men in chains who had been selling debtors in secret to slavers in a bay not far from a lighthouse that everyone had assumed no longer lit anything. Jon wanted to hang them from the lighthouse and light them. He did not. He stood and watched as they were tried and bound to years of work under the eyes of the people they had harmed, and he wondered if mercy had any scent besides bitterness. Trickles from the Reach began arriving in the form of letters that had learned to be polite. In Old Town, scholars wrote treatises on representation that were as beautiful as cathedrals and as immediately inhabitable as neither. In the Arbor they sent wine and called it diplomacy. In the Vale, the woman at the Eyrie sent a list of practical questions so long it could have provided shingles for a roof. Jon answered half and told her the other half would be answered by time. She replied that time keeps poor ledgers unless forced and sent a steward south to teach the city how to measure weather against roof tiles as if both were equations. In the West, a man with gold in his beard and iron in his jaw crowned himself in a hall that had once echoed with the laughter of those who thought wealth could buy weather. He sent ravens with the old iron words and received back parchment that said, simply, The councils welcome any man who wishes to work and will elect him if he convinces enough others to be worthy. When the second election came in the city, some were turned out and took it badly and then, astonishingly, got on with their lives because their lives were more than offices. A washerwoman who had believed the title counselor would settle on her as a permanent warmth lost to a schoolmaster who had spent his year learning how to listen. She didn't curse. She cried and then joined the schoolmaster's committee on street safety because she had learned that a title is only a tool. Sansa visited the city that autumn, riding with 24 Northmen and women who looked at the heat like a dangerous rumor. They walked through the markets that had learned how to police themselves not with cudgels, but with shame and banishment. Jon watched her see the fishwife she did not know she recognized. And the fishwife watched Sansa measure a piece of sea glass and smile in a way that did not perform. The two women spoke for an hour in the shade while the world tried to find a language that fitted both of them. "Do you ever wonder what Father would think?" Sansa asked Jon later, looking at the dragon asleep upon the broken castle like a penitent monument. "Of this? Of any of this? Every day?" Jon said. "And then I stopped wondering because I remember the look in his eyes when he taught me to hold a sword. It wasn't about the sword. It was about holding a thing well enough that it didn't own you." They walked where kings had walked and did not say the word for them. Sansa took his arm not as a lady does a lord, but as a sister does a brother whose knee aches when it rains. In winter, the snows returned and turned the city into a study of smoke. The councils discovered how to ration with a ledger that had learned compassion without abandoning arithmetic. A child died of a fever that should not have killed her, and Jon sat with her mother not because he could change it, but because some things are not for changing. They are for attending. A baker died at the oven on a morning the city needed bread, and 3 neighbors took his place before the dough had fallen. The High Septon blessed the hands of anyone who asked and, when he ran out of oil, used water. There were still knives. There were always knives. But less often they were carried by men who had been told their names carried rights, and more often by men who had been told that if they killed this one particular person, they would wake up in a world that looked like yesterday. Jon learned that yesterday is a powerful drug, and that you cannot outlaw it. You can only create a present large enough for people to live in. In the 3rd year, the Iron Bank sent a different delegation. The walnut-voiced man had grown a little heavier, which is what happens when waiting sits upon a chair. The woman's eyes were less busy but no less precise. They did not request a hearing so much as arrive at the Great Council and sit and listen and, over days, ask questions whose answers were often unglamorous. At the end of the week, the woman stood and addressed the council. "We have concluded that predictability is an asset," she said, and someone in the back snorted helpless laughter. She smiled. "Bankers can, when they remember they are human. Your ledgers are clear. Your collections are honest. Your willingness to replace idle or corrupt members has been tested more than once and found robust. We will extend you credit against your next year's collections at a rate that acknowledges your risk and ours both." Davos whispered, "That's their word for liking us. It's their word for not minding that they can't own us," Sam whispered back. When the first great famine struck elsewhere and not here, the city sent grain north and south, east and west, and asked nothing in return but receipts. Those receipts were recorded by the Great Council and used later to ask for help when a winter storm broke 3 piers and half the fishing fleet. Reciprocity grew like ivy on stone that had once pretended it needed no covering. The old houses were still there, names engraved on lintels, men and women walking beneath them with the posture of those who once commanded. Some sat on councils, some would not yet deign. Most had found that their pride tasted better when folded into a thing larger than a crest. Word came from Dorne that their princes, who had never been quite like other lords, had opened their water laws to councils of the Oasis, and that the desert was teaching them a new democracy older than cities. Word from the Isles came in the form of raids, then delegation, then boasts of being first once. The councils learned the old truth that men who live by taking can learn to live by trade if the profit is more regular and the punishment regular. Jon grew thinner and more lined. His hair grayed at the temples early, and Arya used to tug the gray with 2 fingers and say, "You're finally catching up." He laughed more easily and slept far less. Nights, he dreamed of snow falling upon the dragon pit, and of the single decree spoken into that cold. He dreamed of the girl whose father had found her, and of a dragon's eye glancing upon an ocean and finding it too small. I thought it would take fire to change the world, he admitted to Sam one late night, watching the river carry ghost lamps of fishermen. I thought fear would do the work. It only opened the door. Opening doors is not nothing, Sam said gently. But yes, the work is chairs and meetings and ending a day not with a victory, but with a decision that offends fewer than it helps and helps more than it harms. Some nights, John confessed, I want to swing a sword until every argument stops making noise. Then pick up your pen, Sam said, and John did, and kept doing. When the time came that hatred gathered itself into an army one last time and marched under a banner that was not a lion or a flower or a kraken but a blank sheet of cloth, a negation rather than a symbol, John rode out to meet them with captains chosen by lots and a plan chosen by debate. Drogon flew above like a dark promise. In the parley tent, the general of the blank banner took off his helm and revealed the face of a man who might have been anyone's father if bitterness had not been allowed to become his home. You have taken from me the pride of place, the man said. I used to know who I was. Now I am just another man. You say that as if it were small, John said. It is small, the man replied. The world is more manageable when it is smaller. I liked it more when I knew what my hands owned by right. You liked it, John said. Others did not. We will not go back so that your liking can stretch out over our lives. Then we fight, the man said. We do, John answered. But when one of us falls, we remember his name and bury him with regard. And when it is done, those who survive will vote, even if they defy us. That is what it means to be what we are now. The battle felt like a poor epilogue to an argument that had already been won by bread and ink. Men died bravely and stupidly. Women died defending wells. Boys and girls lived who might have died in another story because the supply wagons did not break and the medics had been voted the money they needed months ago. Dragons do not care for infantry tactics, but Drogon learned to fly patterns that frighten horses without burning them. The blank banner burned at the end not by dragon fire, but by a misstep of its own men that felt apt. When it was over, John stood in a field that might grow barley again and felt so tired that even the weight of his own name seemed an undue burden. Sansa arrived at dusk, her cloak carrying the north into the south as if she were a seamstress for geography. She put her arm around him and spoke a single W. Ord, brother. And for a moment that was all the language he required. They will keep trying, she said later, as they watched the Great Council debate how to apportion reparations without creating the very inequalities they had fought. Not because they are monsters, because they are tired, and tiredness wants easy walls. And because those of us who can recite these laws in our sleep will sometimes, without seeing it, create new crests out of our cleverness and call them councils. I know, John said. That is why I wrote only one decree, so the rest would not wear my shape. You could have made yourself a king, Sansa said, not as praise or blame but as a weather report. You chose to make yourself a sentence instead, one with a period. He almost smiled. A sentence others could argue with. A point that could be erased by a majority later. A stubborn majority, she said dryly. We are good at those. I think you will die before this is done, John. I think that is the only way anything like this ever happens. A man gives more years than he ought to an idea that deserves them. I will die, John agreed, with or without the idea. He looked at Drogon asleep upon an old hill that had once held a gallows and now held nothing at all. I want it to be true that after I go, the work is easier. It won't be, Sansa said, but it will be more familiar. That is a kind of ease. The years gathered themselves like prayer stones. The city learned how to replace a counselor without blood. The North learned how to be led by those who went to see more than they went to Godwoods. The Vale learned how to vote with ropes and pulleys when roads iced. The Reach learned how to calculate rain as justice. Dorne kept sending questions that reminded everyone that heat is merely winter at a different speed. The Faith stopped asking itself if godly authority required crowns to bless. It began asking what a life looks like when a god is a ladder and not a wall. The Iron Bank sent a third delegation and brought with it a gift of paper that could be signed in one town and counted in another. Davos laughed and called it magic. Sam sighed and named it something Latin. The fishwife called it a promise she could fold and put in her bodice. When the day came that Jon could no longer mount Drogon without help and refused the help, he walked instead. He walked the length of a street named for a baker who had died at an oven, and down to a pier where children were learning how to swim with ropes tied gently about their waists. He walked to a simple hall where the great council sat at tables scarred by ink and knives. He did not sit in the center. He sat near the door, because old habits are maps. He listened to an argument about whether a bridge should be rebuilt from stone or wood. He listened to a woman demand that the city accept 50 families from a village swallowed by a landslip and not quibble about where to house them. He listened to a boy explain a new way of tallying votes that did not disadvantage streets where folk worked at night and could not make daylight meetings. He listened until hearing hurt his ears like cold hurts fingers. Then he rose and walked back to the dragon pit. Snow began to fall on the broken city like ash. Drogon lay within the old circle, his breathing slow, his eye upon Jon as if the two had kept an appointment past its natural hour. Jon stood in the place he had stood so many years before. He put his hand upon the scarred stone and remembered the faces of those who had risen to shout and fallen to listen. "I was a hammer," he whispered. "Once." Drogon exhaled. The heat wrapped him like a cloak he had earned. "Now I am a nail," Jon said, eyes closing as the flakes found his lashes and melted there. "And I hold this thing down as long as I can." When he died, it was not on a field with a sword in his hand, but in a bed that dozens had built in a room that hundreds had helped clean. He died in a city that had chosen him once and chosen others 100 times since. He died under a ceiling mended by a mason who had never known a lord's name. He died while the Great Council argued over how to tax a new trade in glass lenses without breaking the ones that were making eyes young again. Sansa was there, and Arya, and Brienne, and Davos, and Sam, and the fishwife who had taught the clerk about rot, and the boy who had once explained voting for night workers and was now a man with the sun asleep in his lap. They were not a court, they were a circle. After, the city mourned. The faith tolled its bells and the godswood listened with its old leaves. The Iron Bank closed early for 1 hour not because of profit but because of respect. The North held a silence at dawn that was so complete a fox crossing a field looked around, offended to find itself loud. The Vale unfurled a rope bridge and called it Snow's Span. The Reach planted trees that would take a century to shade a road. Dorne sent a letter that contained no questions. On the first page of the charter, beneath the line about ladders, the Great Council added a single sentence in a hand that looked like many hands at once. One decree opens the door. Many hands keep it from closing. Years later, a child asked her mother what a house had been, and the mother thought of rooms and meals and voices and said, "What we are in together." The child frowned, unsatisfied, and the mother continued, "Once it meant a crest. Now it means a circle." The child drew one on the floor with chalk. Others came and sat inside it. Outside, snow fell upon the city like ash and melted into water that found its way into every jar. Above, a dragon wheeled once and then again, not as a warning this time, but as a habit of a creature who had made this air his home. And in the halls, men and women argued because they cared, and voted because they could, and went home because they had homes to go to that belonged to them by the only right that finally matters. The work of living in them, together. The winter after the bells for Jon told was a lean one, not harsh as the years that starved songs out of men, but lean enough to show where fat had been hiding. Sansa remained through the first month, long enough to listen to old women name their daughters after the counselors who had seen them through a fever, long enough to stand in the scriptorium and trace with 2 fingers the line that said no office would become a title. She ate stew with the fishwife and Davos, and watched as 3 apprentices argued over whether a pier should be set an arm's length further north because the current had shifted. She saw a girl with ink on her nose count votes twice because she did not trust her own hand the first time, and then grinned because she had been wrong and would be the one to announce the true tally herself. When Sansa left, it felt like frost leaving a window. The world did not warm, but the room remembered what the sun looked like. Arya stayed until the first thaw, and then the itch took her like a tide. She walked the city before dawn and found the alleys that breathed in sleep, the corners where knives waited for excuses, the rooftops where cats made treaties the size of paws. She followed rumors like a trapper follows prince and returned with men in chains and women who had been told they were property and a boy who had believed his debt was his name. When she announced at the Great Council that she would go west at last to see what water ended in, no one tried to hold her. They had learned something of circles and how they cannot be tightened without strangling. Brienne embraced her once, eyes bright and posture unbent, and said only, "Come back even if you don't arrive." Arya laughed, the sound like flint catching, and left. 2 days later, a small council of children formed at the western quay to watch the horizon. And every evening one of them would solemnly say, "Not yet," and the others would nod as if that were sufficient. Davos found himself called Master Davos in the streets, which made him wince until the term shed its old skin and became something closer to neighbor. He taught boys to tie knots their fathers had never taught them because their fathers had never had time to fish for the city instead of for a lord. And he showed girls how to read a cargo list and spot when a tallyman tried to shave a barrel by parchment. In the council, he learned to say, "Aye, but who pays?" The way a septon asks which saint is meant, and he watched the numbers behave and misbehave like dogs that could hunt if not indulged. Sam grew heavier and then thinner again in the way of men whose study begins to consume them. He read the old chronicles and learned how the first men had once held moots where each clan sent a voice and how those moots had hardened into councils and then softened into courtly whisperings until the sharpest knife was the cleverest lie. He wrote a small book called The People's Moot and the Realm's Keeping, full of plain sentences and few flourishes, in which he argued that if councils were not given teeth, they would become festivals. He quoted the charter's first page and, in margins, wrote more plainly, "If you do not prosecute your friends when they steal time or coin, you will have no enemies left to catch. You will only have thieves." The faith learned slowly to let go of the notion that authority must be singular. The High Septon convened a convocation of Septs the Winter after Jon's passing, a meeting the size of a small war in which 100 lesser septons and septas argued over the very bones of liturgy. Some wanted to add to the 7 and 8, the stranger's change. Others thought that blasphemy and wrote instead a rubric for blessing councils, requiring 3 things before oil could spill. A ledger made public, a court that had tried a counselor and not balked, a school that taught girls letters alongside boys. The iron among them objected. The iron among them also fed more hungry families than any winter in memory. When someone suggested reviving the faith militant, the High Septon answered with a quiet flatness that changed the air. "We do not raise swords to guard crowns anymore. We raise ledgers to guard bread." The Iron Bank, gnawing at the edges of its own pride, did business like a man who refuses to say good morning. They discovered that collateral which was not a person could, in fact, be steadier, and sent experts to whisper in the ears of stewards about interest and default and grace periods. Davos leaned back during one such lecture and asked the question everyone else had been too polite to ask. "If a council refuses entirely to pay, what do you seize?" The banker smiled as if he had expected the question, since he was 12 years old, and said, "Reputation." Davos laughed until his eyes watered. "For once, you and a smuggler have a faith in the same god." In the north, Sansa's experiment took on the shape of pine and ice. The Great Council of the North met in Wintertown rather than the castle, though the first time it did so the wind came down the spine of the King's Road so fiercely that the tent ropes had to be doubled and a Mormont volunteered her bears to lean on the poles. When a lord in a rich cloak suggested they move the meeting inside where it was warm and the doors closed, a woman from Deepwood Mott who had walked 2 days to be there pointed at the tent's opening and said, "This is why we came." Elections were slow at first, not because the North disliked choosing, but because it had grown used to choosing with swords. Spears were traded for stones with names scratched on them. Letters were sent to fishing villages in Darkwater and to nooks in the mountains where snowdrifts learned to whisper. And the answers came back in yes written as "I," and "if the gods will it," and "I suppose so," and "I'd like to try." The first Northman to be removed from his post did not go quietly. Ash. He was an umber who had traded wood at double price to a cousin, and when his name and ledger were read aloud his face went winter pale and he said he had not thought anyone would notice. He had thought wrong. He gathered 80 men and barricaded himself inside a hall built of old oaths and newer lies. Sansa rode out without fanfare. She did not bring the dragon. The North's grammar did not know how to conjugate fire. She brought weavers and smiths and 1 septon and 2 crannogmen and a boy who could fit in narrow places and a wagon full of food. The hall held out 3 days against hunger and 2 days against shame. On the 6th day, the Umber opened his doors and offered his sword. Sansa took it. She handed him a hammer. "You'll pay your fine and repairs," she said, and the man nodded. And the children watched his back bend on the scaffolding and learned that shame can be a ladder when there is a rung to step upon. The Ironborn tried the old way once more, rowing in at night with fire pots and axes and a song in their throats about paying the iron price. They expected soft merchants and softer guards. What they found were piers that came apart at a signal, dumping raiders into waist-high water in winter, and lines of net that rose from beneath like snakes made of rope, tangling oars and limbs. The dock guard used hooks meant for tarpaulins and words meant for markets. A woman who had been selling oysters that morning took a raider by the ear and told him he should be ashamed, and his shame did what no spear had done. It broke him for an instant long enough for a rope to do the rest. When the survivors were dragged before the small court at the harbor, the magistrate, in livery plain enough to be mistaken for a fishwife's apron, read aloud the names of the families they had harmed that day and sentenced the raiders to cut channels for the river that would keep the city from flooding come spring. "We don't enslave," she said when one man spat the accusation. "We sentence. Work is not a chain. It is the thing that breaks chains." In the west, Casterly Rock wore its gold like an old wound. The man with iron in his jaw learned that without the steady drain of taxes from the river and the city, his vaults filled more slowly and his mines demanded care that banners could not provide. He tried to buy influence in the Great Council and found that votes were not sold so easily because the clerks could count coin and people could count faces. He staged grand feasts in the hills and invited the nobler sort to hear him speak of ancient rights. They came for the meat and left when the words tasted stale. When he refused to repair a bridge because the village beyond had voted for a steward he disliked, Old Town sent a letter naming this malicious neglect, and the Vale sent a rope team, and the North sent a mason. And by the time the bridge was repaired, the man's fealty was not required and everyone understood what that meant. The Vale's rope bridges became a kind of language. They sent south not soldiers but engineers who taught city boys how to sling lines across a ravine with a prayer and a pulley. The Ares councils learned to conduct elections when roads closed. Colored stones delivered in sacks stamped with a seal, counted by 3 hands at once. Results walked down by goat paths until they reached a room with stoves and maps. The woman who had promised to measure John at the Aerie measured everyone else with the same cold fairness. She voted for men she disliked because they were competent and against men she loved because they grew lazy. When asked once at a festival how she defined virtue, she said, "In winter, food and shelter. In summer, remembering winter." Old Town, with its 7 towers of books, took to the new world as a man takes to cider he discovers is better than expected. The Archmesters learned to argue without crowning anyone among them with a ring heavy enough to sink a small boat. They wrote a civil code that could be read by a fisherman, and when a fisherman complained that abrogate tasted of dust in the mouth, they rewrote the sentence. A school for girls opened with rooms for letters and numbers and the shipwright's art, and a class where children learned how to stand before a room and speak until their voice found their spine. The Citadel sent midwives north and east and taught them to keep ledgers of births and deaths and fevers. They sent bonesetters and leechers who learned to wash hands between patients and to say, "I don't know yet," as if it were a candle rather than a cloud. When a cough began in a town by the Mander and moved like fog to the harbors, the schools closed for a month and bread was delivered to doors, and the Faith's Fund kept shops from starving, and the Great Council debated loudly but did not forget the baker who had died at his oven. Fewer died than would have under banners. Sam wrote another book. He called it The Ledger of Breath. The wall no longer measured a crown's northern border, but it remained a promise. The Night's Watch, or what called itself that, had changed from a prison that called itself honor to an order that called itself stewardship. Men and women both took the black now, though the black was sometimes a thick brown and sometimes the gray of recycled cloak. They swore not chastity but dedicated labor for 7 winters and summers. with an option to return home if a family loss demanded it and a companion to walk back with them to make sure they did not mistake shame for duty. Free folk came and went through the gates with a formality that resembled reign more than law. Tormund's granddaughter, broad as her name and with red in her hair like a sunset caught in a pine, sat on a chair in a bare hall and told a steward from White Harbor that the agreement about winter fishing would be honored so long as the men from the south did not litter nets with hooks that snag birds. The steward nodded and apologized. He had not known. They dr. Ank a clear liquor that burned truth into voices and laughed like men who had learned the same song different ways. Skago sent a delegation the year the sea froze so thick at Eastwatch that men walked to a sealery and back with boots stiff as boards. They came with obsidian knives and a truce of old ghosts and a request for a teacher. The watch sent two. A woman who had learned to take apart a sentence and put it back without breaking it, and a man who had learned to mend nets and break fights with a hand on a shoulder. Skagosi children learned to write their names as if they were carving bone. And for the first time in memory, Skagosi sat as a visitor on the Great Council and listened to an argument about river tax with eyes that did not blink often. When he spoke, he said, "In winter we kill a seal and eat the fat together." The council wrote a new paragraph about winter commons. Woods to be hunted by all, fish runs to be left for a week for those upriver, herds to be moved by vote. It was not perfect. It was better. Essos watched. The free cities wrote their own letters with their own flavors of threat and praise. Bravos approved of the city's insistence on ledgers and sent a lute player who sang a ballad called The Charter's First Page in taverns until men who had never liked songs with rules hummed it without realizing. Pentos, ruled and not ruled, and often both at once by houses who called themselves magisters, sent a lean man with a smile like a knife to whisper that some contracts could be made to favor both sides if one side happened to be his. The Great Council met with him and then with the clerks who wrote down what he said, and 10 months later the city signed a trade agreement with Pentos that insisted on wage minima for the men who unloaded the slave ships that Pentos pretended it did not sail. 3 years later, Pentos had fewer slavers and more smugglers calling themselves merchants. 5 years later, a Pentoshi guild petitioned to be recognized in the city and offered to pay dues and taxes in exchange for the right to sue men who broke their members' bodies. The petition passed. The first suit ended with a man who owned 2 warehouses repairing crates alongside a boy whose hand he had crushed by hiring a foreman to work men 12 hours a day. Volantis didn't send letters at first. It sent prices. Grain shot up like a spear when a drought struck the Rhône, and for 3 months the city learned how to stretch stew and make laughter taste like meat. Then the price fell as suddenly, and men who had hoarded were caught with barns full of expensive promises. The council's law about hoarders bit. The men bit back. One hired killers who went to the clerk's house at midnight with garrotes and left with scars because the clerk's wife had baked a loaf upon a blade and kept it under the bed since the first knives had come years before. She sliced one man's ear off and he sobbed like a child because pain makes boys of us when we are most sure we are men. The killers were tried not as assassins only, but as agents of price. And the city heard for the first time the phrase economic murder, spoken from a bench. The stepstones, piles of rock between storms, became lawless again when 4 captains decided they preferred laws that changed when they drank. They preyed upon the ships flying the city's new flag, 7-banded like a rainbow, the colors chosen by children because the old colors had too much blood in them, and for a season it felt like the world was turning backward in its sleep. Brienne sailed south with a small fleet, her armor polished clean not to impress but to reflect light into eyes prepared for night. She did not burn. She anchored and sent a letter. When the captains laughed their letters of refusal back, she anchored a second time and sent a different kind of note. A schedule. At dawn the nets went out, pulling not fish but anchors, and by afternoon 2 of the captains found their ships moving whether they wanted to move or not. A battle was avoided because it was arranged into farce. The 2 captains were hauled to harbor, tried by a court with 5 sailors and 4 fishwives and 1 scribe, and sentenced to teach boys and girls for 5 years how to tie knots and read currents. Brienne watched them begin their first classes and saw the twitch in their hands where a blade once lived. She watched the twitch grow slower as a boy with an ear missing learned to splice a rope and smiled like a sunrise that had been late but finally came. Years turned, not as pages in a book someone else wrote, but as a wheel men and women pushed together and cursed together and sometimes sat upon to rest. The Great Council became both boring and holy. Boring because water and pipes can be. Holy because pipes bring clean water and certainty brings faith. Elections became festivals not of drunken banners but of pies with meanings and children tugging at sleeves asking who mother liked and why. And mothers answering not with a name but with a story about a street saved or a tax cut badly and fixed. In one bad cycle, a demagogue with a voice like a drum and an anger like a forge won a seat, and then another and proposed a law to lengthen terms because stability, and to restrict votes to those with stake in property because responsibility. The council let him speak, the city let him speak, and then the fishwife stood on a crate and said, "My stake is my hands." And a mason stood and said, "My stake is your roof." And a widow stood and said, "My stake is my bread." And the demagogue found that a drum without a skin makes no sound. He lost his seat at the next election and went back to selling cartwheels, at which he was excellent, and discovered that excellence is a better altar than applause. Sansa married, not for banners or for ships or to quiet the rumors that a woman who does not marry cannot rule, but for a blacksmith from White Harbor who had a wife's grave and 2 boys and a way of listening that made even Winterfell's stones feel heard. Men said things. They did not say them to her face twice. The blacksmith learned to sit in councils and ask simple questions like, "How many?" and "Who suffers?" And he learned to pour tea for grandmothers who had never been poured tea by a man wearing furs. When he died after 20 years by her side, quick, in his sleep, as if the gods had agreed that smiths deserve mercy. Sansa took off her ring and set it beside a candle and worked the next day as she had the day before. In summer she walked in the godswood with lines around her eyes like roads. In winter she sat by the hearth and repaired a child's mittens. The north loved her the way a field loves a wall that keeps the wind from stealing every seed. She grew old. She did not grow smaller. Sam and Gilly's girl, grown now, took vows not of celibacy but of service at the Citadel, the first woman to wear a chain there and not be given a bucket when men spoke freely. She wrote a treatise on juries that became law in half the villages east of the Trident. She argued that juries should be called not only for crimes, but for the question of who pays when a flood takes a village and who bears the cost when a road moves because a mountain moves. She wrote in a style that smelled of bread, and men read it who had never read anything else. Davos buried 2 sons who had lived to be fathers, which is a kind of luck. He taught the sons of those sons to swear only by their own hands unless they must. And when he died, older than he had ever imagined and with less coin than he deserved, half the dockworkers in the city carried his coffin, and the other half cooked for them. Brienne never married, because the stories that had once tried to tell her what a woman's life must be found themselves without readers among those who loved her. She trained girls to fight until her knees began to argue with her, and then she trained them from a chair and told them where a man who underestimates you will put his foot, and she was right every time. When she died, it was in her chair, and the girls she had trained, women now, and men too, took the chair apart and repaired a plank in a school with its wood. Arya's ship did not return for a long time. When it did, it came with a keel that smelled of foreign resin and a hull that spoke of storms like mountains. Arya walked down the gangplank with hair threaded in salt and eyes that had measured sunsets on waters that did not end. She told no stories the first night. The second, she sat by the river and spoke of an island shaped like a sleeping whale, and a people with nets that sang when they were cast, and a city of coral that was not a city because no one stayed, and of a boy who had never seen snow and laughed when it touched his tongue. She brought back seeds that liked wind and fishhooks that liked the dark, and a song about a woman who followed a turtle across the sea. She stayed a year, then another, teaching children to read currents on a map that included places their grandparents had never named. One spring day, she left again with a dozen young mariners who had been elected to be brave, and the city watched them vanish over a line that had become thinner even though the world was as wide as ever. The dragon endured. Drogon grew slow the way old hills grow slow. He ate less, slept more, and chose roofs that were gentle. He never burned again. He flew sometimes at dusk, once around the city, once around the river, once along the shore until the lighthouse counted his passing. The children called him grandfather, which annoyed the men for a week and then did not, and enraged the old women for an afternoon and then made them smile when no one watched. One autumn he did not rise from the dragon pit. He lay with his head upon his tail and his eye half open, watching a sky that had arranged itself into the season's common pattern. Gray upon gray, a scrap of blue like an old ribbon. Folks came. They did not crowd. They came as a procession of accidents. A baker with a loaf for the night guard, a girl with a white stone she had found and believed he would like, a mason with a hand on his son's shoulder, a septa with oil she did not pour. The high septon came without bells and stood with his hands folded and said nothing because there is nothing to say when a mountain bows. At dusk, Drogon breathed out and did not breathe in. His body took a day and a night to still. When he was cold, the city and the north and the Vale and the Reach and Dorne and the Isles and the Watch sent delegations with handcarts and ropes, and together they pulled and rolled and levered until the dragon lay in a hollow the size of a small village carved from a hill outside the city. They covered him with stones. They planted trees. The charter received an addendum, written by a dozen hands and argued for a week. We remember the fire that opened the door by building what cannot burn. In time, the Great Council faced a question no dragon could answer and no law had yet considered: how to mend a memory. A village on the Blackwater had named itself for a lord who had once owned a mine and half the boys in the village. The mine had caved and the lord had paid for coffins or did not, depending on who told it. The village wanted to rename itself for a midwife who had carried a boy out of the shaft on her back, then birthed his child 18 years later. The great-grandson of the lord, who had learned to be a good man without ceasing to be a proud one, objected, not out of cruelty, but because his father had carved the name into the village sign with hands that shook and he could not bear to see them erased. The council did what it had learned to do. It heard both. It asked questions about bread and roofs that were not really about bread and roofs, and then it proposed the sign would be turned. On one side, the old name, to remember the warning. On the other, the midwives, to remember the rescue. The village laughed at first, then they shrugged. Then they went to the river and turned the sign. Sometimes a compromise is merely a delay. Sometimes it is a new place to stand where you can see both shores at once. The last of the old lords died in a bed beneath a crest that had faded like old blood. His grandchildren argued over whether to sell the tapestries. They ran for council seats instead. One lost and discovered he preferred repairing wheels to sitting in rooms. One won and discovered she preferred sitting in rooms to repairing wheels. Both learned that their likes were not laws. The charter was copied in 400 hands and sent to every village that wanted it and every city that pretended not to. It changed as it traveled, as all living things do. In one valley, a paragraph about water rights grew 3 arms to deal with beavers. Along a coast where kelp fed half the town, a clause about the commons included the word seaweed for the first time in any law. In a mountain hamlet, a sentence about snowplows was thickened into 3 about men with shovels and a keg and how to alternate. The first page did not change, though someone somewhere always wanted to gild it. The ladder stayed a ladder in plain ink. Bridges failed, they were rebuilt. Banks failed, others rose. Children learned to count with pebbles, and then with chalk, and then with ledgers, and learned that counting people mattered more than counting coin. Men grew tired of meetings and then remembered how it felt not to be asked and went back. Women who had borne 14 men's insults before breakfast bore one more, and then made a rule that men insult each other instead because they were better at not crying. There were hard years. A flood tore through 3 districts and drowned 100. A famine took 200 quietly because quiet is how famine prefers to kill. A fire leapt a lane and ran along rooftops like a thief and was only stopped because the guard had practiced with barrels of water every first moon for 10 years. A sickness came that took no children and all the old men between 60 and 80, and the city rang with the sound of benches becoming empty and stories being told 3 times because a story refuses to die if it can help it. There were soft years, too. A harvest so abundant that children complained of apples at every meal. A fish run so heavy the river looked like a moving floor. A winter warm enough to make men anxious and gardens riotous with herbs in month 7. Everywhere, the new words learned their work. Steward instead of lord, council instead of court, charter instead of decree. representation instead of inheritance, jury instead of champion. And when, in some alley where men had learned only half the lesson, someone muttered that it would be easier if one strong man decided, a woman would say, "For him," and the alley would laugh, and because laughter is the only god who can sit in taverns without ordering anyone to kneel, the mutterer would blush and buy a round and forget his mutter for a night. On a day that began like any other, mist on the river, bread wrapping the sides of ovens, a ship's bell counting the slow, Sansa arrived in the city for what everyone understood without saying would be the last time. She wore a plain cloak and walked slower than Pride would have liked. She went first to the school with the girls who punched posts with wrapped hands, and then to the hall where the Great Council met, and then to the Dragon Pit, which had become a garden of stone and shadow. She sat on the bottom tier, no one stopped her, and watched the wind move through grasses that had taken root in the ash. A boy of about 10 approached with the courtesy of someone who had been told all his life that circles make room. "Are you lost?" he asked, careful not to insult her age. "No," Sansa said. "I am exactly where I should be." He looked around at the pit. He looked back at her. "It doesn't look like much," he said, "because children make honest men of the old." "It looks like enough," she said. "Sometimes that is more." He nodded as if he understood, and perhaps he did. He sat beside her without asking, and they watched dust dance in a shaft of sun until a bell sounded and he rose and ran off to add his pebble to a jar. She stayed until the shadow of the highest arch had crossed the stones where Jon had once stood. Then she stood. She placed her palm flat upon the warm rock as if it were a brow, and she whispered, "We kept it, and the stone, which records more than it pretends, kept her words." In a village far upriver, a woman told a story to a child who had asked why no one wore crowns anymore. She spoke of a man who had made a single sentence with a dragon at his back, and of how that sentence had made rooms full of people possible. The child frowned and said it would be easier to have a king because kings decide and then you get to go play. The woman laughed, a sound like a gate opening. She said, "It would be easier. Easy is how you sleep through winters and wake up in hunger. Easier is how you forget names. Harder is how you remember." The child considered this and then ran outside to draw a circle in dust and shout for other children to come sit in it and argue about pies. The woman watched and felt the old ache that means you have done both too much and not enough. She went to the shelf and took down a book and read the first page aloud to the empty room, and the words sounded like a ladder that many hands had put up, and the room felt taller because of them. When Arya came back for the last time, she was old enough to be mistaken for a grandmother in a port where she had once been mistaken for a boy. She had a scar above her left eyebrow from a place where the wind cut like a blade, and she carried a shell with holes in it that sang when you held it to your ear. She gave the shell to a child and did not tell him what it was. She let him discover its song himself. She sat with Brienne's trainees and watched their feet and told them that stabbing is a question and parrying is an answer, and that sometimes the best move is to stop dancing and go drink water. She walked with Sansa to the Dragon's Hill, and they did not speak for a long time because they did not need to. When Sansa died a winter later, Arya stood in the Godswood alone and spoke not to gods but to the tree, which is what some call gods when they do not require answers. Then, at dawn, she boarded a small ship with a crew that had learned to plan for days when wind refused to remember its job. She left without fanfare because she had never liked the taste of it. The city watched her sail out of habit and hope, and then it turned back to its work. The Great Council enacted a law the following spring that no street should be without a tree that touched a second-story window. It was frivolous, an old mason said, and a waste of coin, a young banker agreed. It turned out to be both and neither. Children climbed and fell and learned to land. Lovers sat and promised, and some kept the promises. Birds returned, and cats grew smug. In summer, leaves cooled the stones enough to make walking pleasant. In winter, branches held snow in the shape of roofs. The city looked different from above now, green threaded through gray, a soft net. When the first of those trees was old enough to be climbed by a man whose knees didn't like steps anymore, he climbed anyway and sat there laughing until someone told him to come down. And he said no because down was not where they were going. A boy in a mountainside village read the charter underlining words that would serve him later in a room with a table and 17 impatient men. A girl on an island learned to count fish properly and then to count men properly. And when a captain shouted, she asked him for his ledger, and he gave it because he had learned that shouting is not a ledger. A woman in the Reach wrote to the council with a proposal about bees and how hives could be registered and measured and how honey could be shared. And the council laughed and then wrote a law about bees that ended more arguments than any dragon ever had. A man in Dorne invented a new kind of hinge. A woman in the Vale invented a new kind of story told by ropes and bells across a canyon. The Isles sent a musician who played an instrument made of shell and gut, and men cried without knowing why and then voted easily for a harbor repair because music is a vote taken with the lungs. There were failures. A steward in a town by the Green Fork decided he liked his office too much and began to hold court at night so that the men who worked by day could not come. He was removed and screamed and then quieted and then found himself in charge of the lamp oil storehouse where he learned to count for light instead of against it. A court tried a case too quickly and put a boy in a cell for a month. And when he came out, his eyes would not look at doors. The magistrate who had hurried the judgment resigned and spent a year teaching the boy to carve and the next year teaching other boys not to be cruel. A council borrowed too much and a bridge stood half-built for a winter and men cursed it every morning. And in spring the bridge was finished and no one remembered the curse, which is the way some curses end. The last winter of the 1st century of the Charter was not cruel, but it was long. Snow fell and fell again. The rivers moved under ice like secrets under lids. The Great Council met by lamplight and read reports of how at Tall Oaks a roof had caved and a family had moved into the school and how neighbors had taken turns making soup on a stove that had once only made ink. They read of a village on Skagos where a bear was found in a kitchen and allowed to finish its meal because it was thinner than the family. They read of a town in Dorne where the trees had forgotten how to sleep and fruit had come early and rotted and how clever boys had made vinegar and sold it by scoops and paid the girl who had given them the idea twice the coin any boy got because she had done the thinking work and that is worth. They argued whether a city's roads should be sprinkled with sand or straw. And a child in the gallery raised his hand and said, "What about both?" And the council laughed at itself and wrote, "Both." On the night the snow finally stopped, bells rang in 7 districts at once, and men walked out into streets where quiet had waited and looked up at a sky that had become suddenly too big. They watched the stars and counted even though they did not know their names. A woman who had counted all her life without knowing wrote down the numbers because numbers, too, are a kind of memory. A man turned to his neighbor and said, "What now?" And the neighbor said, "Work," and they both smiled, because work was no longer a whip but a song. Somewhere beyond the horizon Arya chased a new edge and laughed when it moved. In the north, the wind said Sansa's name and then stopped as if a mouth had closed in satisfaction. On the Hill of Stones, roots threaded old bones that had once flown, and spring cracked the earth a finger's breadth. In the city, the Charter sat on a table and gathered thumbprints. Children grew and argued and voted and lost and won and lost, and found they preferred this to winning without deserving. A woman underlined a sentence in the first page and whispered, "We keep it down together." A man closed a shop early to carry sand to a city crew because he had been carried once. A girl invented a new way to make a bell sound like 2 bells at once. A boy planted a tree and measured his height against it every year. No one wore crowns. They wore caps and hoods and bare heads and the occasional ribbon on festival days. They wore the faces of people who had decided their names were not orders but introductions. They went home in evenings to rooms warmed by fires someone had cut and divvied. Ed and blessed with nothing but the sharing. They slept and dreamed of meetings that lasted too long and of rivers that ran too fast and of dragons that flew once around the sky to check that the edges held. They woke and went back to the work of holding, which is the work of living, which is the only work worth any decree at all.